Nobody really tells you what this particular stage of life feels like from the inside, not honestly anyway. You get the greeting card version, the version where everyone assures you it's supposed to feel peaceful, well-earned, a long-deserved reward after decades of work. And for some people, I'm sure that's exactly true. But for a lot of us, it doesn't feel like that at all, at least not right away. And nobody prepares you for the gap between what you're supposed to feel and what you're actually. Before I go any further, if you're new here, welcome, and if any part of what I've said so far already sounds like something you needed to hear, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because I don't want you to lose track of this channel before we get to the part of the story that actually matters most. I say that not because I need the number to go up for its own sake, though of course that helps keep this going, but because I've heard from enough people by now to know that these stories tend to find the people who need them at exactly the moment they need them, sometimes long after they first subscribed, scrolling back through late at night during a hard stretch, looking for something that says plainly, "You are not the only person who has felt this way." If that ends up being you someday, I want to make sure this is easy to find again. So take care of that now. It takes 2 seconds, and then let's keep going, because there's quite a bit more to this story, and I don't think the version I've told you so far does justice to where it actually ends up. I want you to picture something for me. You're sitting in a recliner, in a house you've owned for 33 years, and the television is on, and it's not on because you want to watch anything. It's on because the silence without it is a specific kind of weight you haven't figured out how to carry yet. And you're looking at the wall across from you, the one with the photographs, the one with the whole arc of a life pinned to it in matching frames, and you're thinking, not for the first time, not even for the 100th time, that this might just be what the rest of it looks like, sitting here, getting through days, waiting for something that isn't going to come, and that you're not even sure you'd know how to name if it did. That's not rock bottom. That's just a Wednesday afternoon, for a couple of years, if you let the geography trap you inside it. My name is Wyatt. I'm 71 years old, and 14 months ago, I bought a one-way ticket to the Philippines, with 2 checked bags, and a carry-on that had more books in it than clothes. And I did it because the alternative was continuing to do exactly what I just described, sitting in that recliner, watching a television I didn't care about, in a house that had stopped feeling like mine about 6 months after my wife Ellen died, and I had somehow convinced myself that this was what retirement looked like, and that I was supposed to find it acceptable. I didn't find it acceptable. But for a while, I didn't find anything else either. If this kind of story matters to you, go ahead and subscribe right now, because there's more of this coming, and I think you're going to want to be here for it. Ellen and I were married 43 years. We met in Columbus, Ohio, in 1979, at a party neither of us had particularly wanted to go to, thrown by a mutual friend who had that specific gift certain people have of correctly predicting who ought to meet each other before either party has any idea themselves. I was 27, she was 25, and I was working at the time as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm that mostly did commercial work, parking structures and warehouse buildings, nothing that would ever appear in an architecture magazine, but steady, solid, real work that suited me well enough that I stayed with variations of it for the next 36 years. Ellen taught 4th grade for the first 8 years of our marriage, and then, after our daughter Claire was born and we made the mutual decision that someone ought to be home more consistently, she became the kind of mother and homemaker who made it look so effortless from the outside that people who knew us socially sometimes forgot entirely that she'd given up her own career to do it, which used to bother her more than she ever let on to those people, and more than I probably acknowledged to her at the time. We had 2 children, Claire, who lives now in Denver with her husband and my 2 granddaughters, and Marcus, who lives in Atlanta and has, over the past several years, become the kind of son I'm embarrassed to admit I didn't fully appreciate when he was still at an age where it might have changed something between us earlier. We moved around some when the kids were young, following work the way you do in that part of your career, when you're still building towards something, and geography is more of a variable than a fixed point. Columbus to Indianapolis, to a stretch in Dallas that neither of us ever entirely loved, and both of us have mostly edited out of the family story in the way you quietly revise certain chapters. Then we settled in a suburb of Cincinnati called Mason, Ohio, when Claire was 9 and Marcus was 6, and we stayed there for 22 years, long enough that it stopped being where we lived and just became home in the complete, unremarked-on way that places become home when you stop noticing them specifically. I retired at 64, 2 years earlier than I'd originally planned, because a buyout offer came through that was structured well enough that leaving didn't feel like losing anything, and Ellen and I spent the first 3 years of my retirement doing the things people say they'll do when they finally have time, traveling some, visiting Claire in Denver twice a year, and Marcus in Atlanta, taking a cruise that we both agreed afterward was fine, but that neither of us needed to repeat, spending more time simply being in the same house during daylight hours than we'd managed in 40 years of marriage, which turned out to be something we were both genuinely good at and genuinely happy doing. Then Ellen got sick, ovarian cancer, caught late because it almost always is, because it's famously quiet until it isn't, and by the time it stopped being quiet, there was only so much that any amount of good intentions and excellent doctors and stubbornness could do about the fact that it had already done what it did. We had 16 months from diagnosis to the end, 16 months that I cannot honestly describe to you as entirely terrible, because they weren't. They were also full of things I wouldn't trade, conversations we'd deferred for decades that we finally stopped deferring, whole days spent doing nothing except being in the same room with the specific awareness that being in the same room was the thing that mattered most, not what we were doing in it. But they were also 16 months of watching someone I had loved for 43 years move toward a door I couldn't follow her through, and the gap between those two true things, the gratitude and the grief, is something I don't think collapses neatly into any single sentence. Ellen died on a Tuesday in March, at home, the way she'd asked to, with Claire and Marcus both there, and with me holding her hand, in the specific way she'd always said she wanted someone to when the time came. And I drove her hospice nurse home afterward, because she lived only 12 minutes away, and it seemed important to have something practical to do immediately, rather than stand in my own living room not knowing what to do with my hands. What came after, I want to describe as honestly as I can, because I think a lot of people in some version of my situation recognize the outline of it without necessarily recognizing themselves inside it, which is part of why it goes on as long as it does before anyone does anything about it. I got up every morning. I made the bed, because Ellen had always made the bed, and it seemed important to continue being the kind of household where the bed got made. I ate breakfast, usually oatmeal, because it required the fewest decisions of anything I could think of to prepare, and in the first months after Ellen died, any decision I could eliminate felt like a genuine mercy. I took walks around the neighborhood in the mornings, the same route Ellen and I had walked together most evenings for 15 years, and I passed the same houses and the same yards, and I nodded to the same neighbors, and sometimes those neighbors would stop me to say something kind about Ellen, and I would say thank you and mean it completely, and then stand there for a moment after they'd moved on, not quite able to get back into the rhythm of the walk, needing a moment to let the kindness settle before it became unbearable, the way kindness about someone you've lost has a specific tendency to become. My mornings had structure. My afternoons did not. The afternoons were the problem. I had not fully understood, in 43 years of working or in 3 years of retired life with Ellen, how much of an afternoon depends on having someone to account to, not in a confining way, but in the basic human way of organizing your time around another person's rhythms, their expectations, their presence. Without Ellen, the afternoons opened up into something that should have felt like freedom, and felt instead like a specific, directionless kind of loss I didn't have vocabulary for. I started filling them with tasks of increasingly dubious necessity. I reorganized the garage twice in 3 months. I alphabetized 3 different sets of things that did not need to be alphabetized. I drove to the hardware store 4 times in a single week, purchasing items that I recognized, even as I was purchasing them, that I had absolutely no concrete plan to use. Claire called every other day, sometimes more, with a consistency that I know cost her something, in terms of her own life and her own family and her own grief, because she had lost her mother and was simultaneously trying to manage her father's visible unraveling from 1,100 miles away. She asked the right questions, whether I was sleeping, whether I was eating properly, whether I was going to anything outside the house, book clubs or church or the neighbors' occasional barbecues that I had always attended before Ellen died and was now quietly declining. I said I was fine, regularly, in the specific tone that means the precise opposite, and that daughters always recognize, and that fathers always hope, somehow goes unrecognized. Marcus drove up from Atlanta twice in the first 6 months, both times unannounced, which I understood was because, if he'd announced them, I would have told him not to come, and I would have been wrong to do so, and he knew me well enough to know it. He would arrive and help me with whatever was visibly piling up, yard work or a car service I'd been deferring, or a pantry that needed organizing in ways that went beyond alphabetization, and he would stay for a weekend, and we would watch football or baseball depending on the season, and cook things together in Ellen's kitchen, with varying degrees of success. And on his last evening, each time he would look at me across the dinner table with an expression that I chose not to fully read, because reading it would have required acknowledging what it meant, which was that he was worried about me in a way that went beyond the ordinary worry of a son for a grieving father. About 8 months in, Claire called on a Sunday with the specific, careful tone that told me she'd been rehearsing the conversation. She had been researching senior living communities, she said, not the nursing home kind. She was very specific about this distinction, but the active retirement kind, the ones with fitness centers and organized activities and group dining and walking paths, some of them really lovely, she said. There was one near Denver she'd actually visited in person, and there was one about 40 minutes from Marcus in Atlanta that had gotten excellent reviews, and she had some information about a few options closer to Cincinnati too, if I wanted to stay near home. She said all of this in the careful voice of someone trying to frame a necessary thing as gently as possible, and I listened to the whole thing, and then I told her I appreciated her thinking about it and that I'd look over whatever she sent. She sent a folder, a digital folder, with PDFs and links and ratings from 3 different senior living review websites. I opened the folder twice in the following 10 days. I didn't click on anything inside it. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't stubbornness, at least not primarily. It wasn't denial about whether something needed to change. Something did need to change. I knew something needed to change, the way you know a tooth has gone bad before you're willing to schedule the appointment. What it was, I think, was that every option Claire had found and researched and lovingly compiled for me looked, from the outside, like a place to go and wait. A nice place, a pleasant, well-reviewed, activity-calendared place to go and wait. And I was 69 years old, and I was grieving, and I was lost, and I was lonely. But I was not ready to go somewhere and wait, because waiting, even in a nice facility with a good dining room, felt from the inside like something I would not survive the way I'd technically survived the previous 8 months. What actually changed things started almost by accident, which I think is probably the only way the genuinely important things ever start. I was at a backyard gathering at the house of a neighbor named Phil, not a close friend, a neighbor in the looser sense, someone I'd talked to over fences for 12 years, without it ever becoming a friendship of the kind that requires actual scheduling. But he hosted a summer barbecue every year that Ellen and I had always attended, and that year I went mostly because not going felt like allowing the geography of my own neighborhood to start shrinking around me, and shrinking geography had been my primary observable symptom for 8 months, and I was aware enough to recognize it, even if I hadn't been ready to do anything dramatic about it yet. At Phil's barbecue, I ended up talking to a man I'd never met before, a friend of Phil's brother, a retired airline pilot named Don, who had moved, 5 years earlier, to a town in the Philippines called Dumaguete, on the island of Negros Oriental, and who was back in the States, visiting family for the... The reaction I got when I first shared what I was planning was more measured than I expected, mostly because by the time I actually said it out loud, I'd already done enough of the groundwork to answer the hard questions, instead of just presenting a feeling and asking for blind trust. There was worry, understandably, the kind of worry that comes from someone who loves you and is trying to picture every way this could go wrong before it happens. I didn't dismiss any of it. I answered what I could answer honestly, admitted what I genuinely didn't know yet, and didn't pretend the whole plan was without real risk, because pretending that would have been its own kind of dishonesty, and I think dishonesty tends to earn less trust than honest uncertainty does, even when the uncertainty is uncomfortable to sit with. Eventually, after a long, quiet pause on the other end of the conversation, I got something short but real, an acknowledgement that fell somewhere between reluctant and genuinely supportive, and I understood, even in that moment, that it was enough, that I wasn't going to get full enthusiasm right away and didn't need it to move forward with something I already knew, deep down, I needed to do. What mattered more than that first conversation, in the end, was what came later, once there was actual evidence to look at instead of just a plan and a promise. Skepticism, I've learned, rarely gets talked out of itself. It gets shown over time through actual results, until eventually it quietly gives way on its own, without anyone needing to win an argument about it. Summer. He was somewhere in his mid-60s, tanned in the specific way of someone who lives outdoors by default, rather than by effort, and he had the quality that I've since come to associate with a particular kind of expat, the quality of someone who has done the hard work of reconstituting an actual life from scratch and arrived somewhere on the other side of that work that is genuinely different from where they started, not better in every measurable way, but alive in a way that shows on a person. I don't know why I asked him as many questions as I did. I usually don't do that, not at social gatherings, not with strangers, but something about how he talked about where he lived, without performance, without the promotional quality of someone trying to sell you on a decision they're still trying to justify to themselves, made me keep going. He talked about the city the way you talk about somewhere that has simply, gradually become yours, the restaurants he went to regularly enough that people knew his order, the community of other expats and local friends that had assembled itself around him over years, the cost of living that had allowed him, on a pension that had felt constraining in the States, to rent a decent apartment and eat well and take occasional trips and still have money left over that he hadn't expected to have. He talked about Dumaguete the way I used to talk about Mason, Ohio, in the years after it stopped being somewhere we lived and became home. I asked him, bluntly enough that I'm still slightly embarrassed by the directness of it, whether he'd moved there to hide. Whether it was the kind of move people make when they're running away from something and calling it running towards something, because that sounds better. He didn't take offense at the question. He actually seemed to have been asked it before, or some version of it, and he said no, and then he thought about it more carefully for a moment and said, well, the first 6 months it was partly that. But running away works differently than people think. The thing you're running from, it comes with you. It always does. What changes is everything around it. And sometimes, everything around it is the thing that was actually doing the most damage. I didn't say much after that. I got another beer and listened to him talk about the climate and the food and the people he'd met and the things he'd found to do with his time, and I nodded and asked a few more questions, and eventually the party moved on the way parties do, and I drove home and sat in the recliner and turned on the television I didn't want to watch and stared at the photographs on the wall. But something Don had said stayed in the room with me, not the specifics, the town name, the practical details, but the shape of the thing. The idea that the geography you're sitting inside of is not a fixed fact about grief, that it's a choice, and that sometimes the choice is slowly finishing you in ways too quiet and too gradual for anyone to call an emergency. I started reading that night, not seriously, I told myself, just out of curiosity, the way you read about places you have no real intention of going, the way you watch travel videos at 11 at night when you can't sleep. I read about the Philippines generally, then about expat communities there, then, specifically, about the city Don had mentioned, Dumaguete. I found forums, the kind of long, dense, honest forums where actual people, in actual situations, talk about what the move was really like, the logistics, and the failures, and the unexpected discoveries, and the things they wish someone had told them before they went. I read for 2 hours that night. I read for 3 hours 2 nights later. I found a forum thread, started by a man who described himself as a 68-year-old widower from Oregon who'd moved to a city in the Philippines called Cebu, and the way he described the first year of living there was so specific and so unglamorous and so honest, including 3 separate paragraphs about things that hadn't worked and that he'd had to figure out in real time, that I trusted it in a way I couldn't have trusted a brochure or a promotional video. He described something I kept coming back to, the experience of arriving in a place where you are not pre-labeled by your loss, where the neighbors and the shopkeepers and the people at the market don't know you as the man who lost his wife because they didn't know you before you lost her, and the way that absence of pre-labeling doesn't make the grief smaller, but gives it a different kind of room to exist in, one that doesn't seal you inside a single identity the way familiar places can. I emailed Don about 3 weeks after Phil's barbecue. I'd gotten his address from Phil, who gave it to me with a small, knowing look that I chose not to examine too closely at the time. I told Don I'd been thinking about what he'd said, and that I had some questions if he was willing to field them. He replied within a day, told me to call him, that it was easier to talk through this kind of thing than type through it. We talked for almost 2 hours. He answered every question I had, and several I hadn't thought to ask yet. And at the end of the call, he said something that I've thought about regularly in the 14 months since. He said, "The thing people always say is that they're worried it won't feel real, that it'll feel like a vacation that keeps going, rather than an actual life. And the thing I always tell them is that feeling real takes time anywhere, but it does come, and when it comes faster than you expect, because ordinary life moves quickly once you let it." I spent the following month doing what I have always done when I'm preparing to make a decision I'm nervous about, which is gathering information so methodically and completely that by the time I make the actual choice, I can't be surprised by anything obvious. I researched the special resident retirees visa, which the Philippines issues through its retirement authority, and which turned out to be straightforward enough that the primary requirements were an age threshold I'd long since met, and a pension or fixed income that I also met without difficulty. I researched international health insurance, specifically structured for retirees living abroad, called 3 different providers, compared their emergency evacuation provisions, because I knew, with total certainty, that this would be the first and most sustained point of concern from both Claire and Marcus, and I wanted a specific, documented answer rather than a vague reassurance that would dissolve under 30 seconds of their practical questions. I researched the healthcare infrastructure in Cebu City specifically, which Don had suggested as the most practical base for a newly arrived American, a major urban center with multiple hospital systems of genuine quality, internationally trained physicians, and a large enough expat community that navigating the healthcare system as a foreigner was something many people before me had already figured out and documented. I read hospital reviews from actual expats on actual forums. I found an online community for American retirees in the Philippines that had a specific subforum dedicated to healthcare questions, and I read 4 months of posts in that subforum over a single weekend, making notes, cross-referencing things, acting exactly like the structural engineer I'd been for 36 years, who needed to understand how a thing was actually built before he could trust his weight to it. And then I booked a 3-week exploratory trip, because the one thing Don had been emphatic about was not making the decision without spending actual time there, not a vacation's worth of time, but enough time to get past the initial dislocation and start to see what ordinary would feel like. I told Claire first. She was quiet for longer than I expected, and then she asked whether this was a grief decision, by which she meant whether I was doing something irreversible in a state of loss that I might feel differently about once the loss had settled some. I told her it might partly be a grief decision, that I wasn't going to pretend my life was working the way it was currently configured, and that a trip to see whether a different configuration might work better seemed like the more honest response to that than continuing to decline her folder of PDFs. She laughed at that, a small, surprised laugh that felt like something releasing. She asked whether she could call me every day while I was over there, and I told her she could call me 17 times a day if it made her feel better, and she said 6 would probably be sufficient. Marcus's reaction was different in the way that Marcus is always different from Claire, less emotionally verbal, more practically focused. He wanted to know who I knew there, whether I'd be traveling alone the whole time, what my contingency was if something went wrong medically. I told him about Don's connections in Cebu, about the forum communities, about the insurance policy I'd already purchased for the trip specifically, and by the end of the conversation, he had moved from active concern to what I've come to think of as Marcus's reluctant neutrality, the posture he adopts when he can't find a specific objection solid enough to anchor his broader worry to. I landed in Cebu on a Wednesday evening in early October, stepped out of Mactan Cebu International Airport into air that was warm and dense in the way I'd expected and that smelled, unexpectedly, of something floral underneath the exhaust and diesel of the airport road. Something I couldn't identify and didn't try to, just noticed, the way you notice things when you're in a place new enough that your senses haven't yet learned what to tune out. Don had put me in contact with a man named Rodrigo, a retired schoolteacher who had spent 4 years running what he described as an informal welcome service for newly arrived expat retirees, not an official organization, just Rodrigo and his considerable network of people who between them knew everything useful about living in Cebu as a foreigner. Rodrigo was 63, compact and energetic, in the way of someone who had never adopted the pace of someone who'd given up, and he met me at my hotel that first evening with a list he'd written by hand on actual paper, recommendations for where to eat, what neighborhoods to explore, which markets to go to for what, which days to avoid the traffic on which roads, a document of genuine practical love compiled by someone who remembered exactly how disorienting those first days were and had decided the only appropriate response was to make a list. I spent the first week mostly just moving around the city, finding my bearings, eating at the places Rodrigo had recommended and a few he hadn't, getting lost twice in the market district, in a way that I forced myself to treat as exploration rather than failure, a reframing that took more effort some moments than others. Cebu City is large and layered and loud, in the specific way of cities that have been doing their thing long enough that they're not performing themselves for anyone's benefit. And it took me several days to stop bracing against the loudness and start simply moving through it, the way you move through any city you're learning to be inside of. The food disoriented me pleasantly, which is the best kind of disorientation. I ate lechon for the first time at a small restaurant Rodrigo had marked with a star on his handwritten list, slow-roasted pork, with skin that shattered at the touch of a fork, and I sat alone at that table for 40 minutes afterward, not because I was still eating, but because I wasn't quite ready to go back outside, and I found, sitting there, that I hadn't thought about the recliner in the house in Mason, Ohio, for something close to 3 hours, which was the longest gap in a very long time. On my 5th day, Rodrigo took me to what he called a gathering, held every other Thursday at the home of a couple named Gemma and Art, a retired Filipino doctor, and her American husband, who had been hosting this particular group of expats and Filipino retirees for 6 years in their home, in a quiet residential neighborhood in the northern part of the city. There were about 14 people there that evening, from various countries, various backgrounds, various chapters of whatever had brought each of them to this specific city on this specific island, and I was introduced to each of them in turn by Rodrigo with a genuine warmth that made each introduction feel less like being processed through a room and more like being specifically, personally placed into it. I sat for 3 hours at that gathering. I talked to a retired British civil engineer named Stuart, who had moved to Cebu 8 years earlier with his wife, and who, 18 months after arriving, had watched his wife fall entirely in love with the city in a way that had settled the question of whether they were staying permanently, without either of them needing to have the explicit conversation. I talked to a retired American nurse named Sandra, who had come initially for a 3-month volunteer position at a local medical NGO, stayed for a year, left for 9 months, and then come back because, as she put it, I kept comparing everything else to it, and everything else kept losing. I talked to a quiet Filipino man named Ben, who had retired from a shipping company in Manila and moved back to his home region of Cebu with his grandchildren nearby, and who talked about the city with the specific, earned tenderness of someone returning to something they'd left too young to fully appreciate. What I noticed, sitting in that room, was the quality of the conversations. Not the content specifically, but the quality, the pace of them, the willingness to go somewhere real without a long warm-up, the absence of the performance of fine that I'd been doing for 8 months with everyone back home who cared enough to ask. These were people who had all, in some form, renegotiated their relationship with where they were supposed to be, and what that was supposed to look like, and whatever that renegotiation had cost them, the result was a particular kind of directness, a willingness to speak plainly about what was hard and what was good, without needing the conversation to conclude on any particular note. I told them, more than I'd expected to tell a room full of strangers, about Ellen, about the 16 months, about the recliner and the television and the garage I'd reorganized twice, about Claire's folder of PDFs. And nobody in that room looked at me with the particular combination of pity and helplessness that I'd grown used to seeing on the faces of people back home when I told them any piece of this. People who cared, but who were also, visibly, slightly relieved that this degree of loss wasn't something they had to figure out how to fix tonight. The people in Rodrigo's friend Gemma's living room just listened, and then several of them talked about their own versions of similar things, not to redirect the conversation away from me, but to show me that the room I was in was built for exactly this kind of honesty and could hold it without discomfort. A man named Frank, a retired accountant from Sacramento who had been in Cebu for 4 years, said something across the table that I've thought about many times since. He said that the thing nobody explains about starting over somewhere new when you're already old, and he said old without apology or qualification, is that you have the advantage of not caring about things that would have paralyzed a younger version of yourself. You don't care about status, not really, not anymore. You don't care about impressing anyone. You don't care about whether the apartment is impressive or whether the neighborhood is the right kind of neighborhood by someone else's metric. You just care about whether you can find something worth getting up for in the morning. And that, he said, is actually a remarkably simple thing to build around, once you've stripped everything else away. I flew home after 3 weeks, with a decision that was, I think, already made, though I spent another 2 months honoring the decision-making process, enough to do the remaining practical work before acknowledging it to myself as made. I worked with an attorney in Cincinnati to sort out the estate planning pieces that needed sorting, made sure the relevant financial and legal structures were in order, confirmed my pension arrangement and its international transfer setup, finalized an international health insurance plan that I then sent in full to both Claire and Marcus, with a cover note explaining every provision in it, because there was no version of this announcement that would go well if I couldn't answer their specific questions before they had a chance to ask them. I sold the house in Mason. I want to slow down on this part, because I think people who haven't done it sometimes underestimate what it actually is. Selling a house you've lived in for 22 years isn't primarily a financial transaction. It's a physical audit of a life, room by room, drawer by drawer, corner by corner. Every closet holds something specific, something with a story attached to it that you have to decide, for each item, whether it still needs a body to carry it or whether it can be released. Ellen's things, specifically, required a kind of patience with myself that I had to consciously apply, because going too fast felt like a dismissal, and going too slow was its own particular trap. I kept more than I should have by any practical measure. I shipped a box overseas that was probably 40% sentimental rather than functional, and I don't regret a single thing in it. I kept the small framed photograph of Ellen and me from our trip to New England in 2011, the one where she's laughing at something off camera that I can't for the life of me remember now, and that I suspect I probably said at the time, without fully registering how much I wanted to remember it later. I kept her handwriting on a birthday card she'd given me for my 65th. I kept the specific coffee mug she'd given me on our 35th anniversary, with a joke on it that was so private and specific to our own history that explaining it to anyone would require explaining 20 minutes of context first, and I intend to explain it to no one. I told Claire and Marcus together, on a video call I'd scheduled formally, rather than approaching it as a casual conversation, because I wanted them both present at the same time, and I wanted them to know I was taking this seriously enough to plan how I said it. I told them I was moving to Cebu, the Philippines, in approximately 6 weeks, that I had done the research and the legal and financial preparation thoroughly, that I had the insurance documentation they both would want to see, that I had actual contacts on the ground there already, and a community I'd encountered during my visit that I was ready to begin building a real life inside of, and that I needed this to not be a negotiation, though I wanted it to be a conversation, and I was genuinely committed to answering every concern they had. Claire cried, not angrily, not in a way that felt like an attempt to change my mind, more in the way of someone who has been holding something at a careful distance for a long time and suddenly can't hold it that carefully anymore. She said she was scared of being far away from me if something went wrong, and I said I understood that completely, and then I told her about the insurance policy in detail, the emergency evacuation provision, the hospital network, the practical community of people on the ground who were not strangers to me in the way they'd been before my visit. She listened to all of it. Then she was quiet for a moment, and she said, "Is this what it would take, Dad, to actually see you be okay?" And I told her honestly that I thought it was. Marcus, as he does, worked through the concerns in sequence. He asked about the legal status of the visa, the tax implications, the practical mechanics of how my pension would reach me monthly, and in what currency, and with what conversion structure. I answered every question. Near the end of the call, in the specific way Marcus has of conceding a point without quite announcing that he's conceding it, he said, "You've done the work here. I can see you've done the work." That was his version of permission, which I didn't need, but which I was genuinely glad to have. I flew out on a Saturday in December, one way, 2 checked bags and the carry-on full of books, and I watched the middle of the country pass beneath me through the window as we climbed west, and then didn't look out the window again until we were over the Pacific. The first months in Cebu were, I want to be completely honest, a complicated mixture. There were days, especially in the first 6 weeks, that I would put in the same category as the worst days in Mason, Ohio. Days when the dislocation sat on me like an actual weight, when the unfamiliarity of everything felt less like adventure and more like a mistake, when the distance from Claire and Marcus and the grandchildren in Denver was not an abstraction, but a specific, physical ache. I want to tell you that because I think the version of this story that leaves out the hard parts isn't useful to anyone. Moving somewhere new does not cure grief. It doesn't even interrupt it reliably. What it does, and this takes time to understand from the inside, is change the texture of the days that grief moves through. Rodrigo checked on me regularly during those early months, appearing with the matter-of-fact consistency of someone who has seen the difficulty of the first stretch and decided the appropriate response is to simply show up without making a performance of showing up. He brought me to the Thursday gatherings at Gemma and Arts, and I went even when I didn't feel like going, which was most of the time in those early weeks, because I'd decided, before I left Ohio, that showing up even when I didn't feel like it was going to be the primary discipline of this period, and disciplines are only worth anything if you hold them when they're inconvenient. I started eating at a small restaurant near my apartment, run by a woman named Imelda, a compact, no-nonsense woman in her late 50s who made a version of sinigang, the sour tamarind soup, that I could not explain to you technically, but that had the specific quality of food, cooked by someone who has been making the same dish long enough that the knowledge of it has moved from their brain into their hands. I went back 3 times in my first 2 weeks. By the 4th visit, Imelda had started bringing my bowl without waiting for me to order, the way you bring something to a regular rather than a customer, and there is no social transaction on earth that accomplishes what being treated like a regular accomplishes for a person who is trying, in whatever small way, to belong somewhere new. About 3 months in, Rodrigo mentioned that a small non-profit working in the Cebu area ran periodic workshops for older adults on using digital tools for communication, banking, government services, things that a lot of people in their 60s and 70s found genuinely confusing and that, if figured out, made an enormous practical difference in their daily independence. The organization was looking for volunteer instructors who understood the practical side of this, who were patient with adult learners, and who could explain things without condescension. I had spent 36 years explaining structural concepts to clients and colleagues who didn't share my technical background. Patient translation of complex things into plain terms was, if anything, the core professional skill I'd spent my career developing. I started volunteering there on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. The participants ranged from 60 to 85, a mix of Filipino men and women of various backgrounds and education levels, and the thing that struck me immediately and kept striking me throughout was how hard they tried. There is a specific quality to adult learning, particularly for things that feel both important and slightly threatening, and the people in those workshops arrived every week with the particular combination of seriousness and vulnerability of people, for whom this was not optional self-improvement, but practical necessity, and they deserved someone who took that seriously. There was a woman named Gloria, 74, who had been trying for months to reliably use the government's digital health record system to manage her own medical appointments, and had been getting stymied at the login stage each time by a password recovery process that was, objectively, poorly designed for someone who had learned to use computers in her late 60s. We spent 45 minutes on a Thursday morning working through it step by step, and when she finally got into her account and could see her own records and upcoming appointments laid out in front of her on the screen, she looked at me with an expression that I recognized immediately because I had seen it before, over 36 years of engineering work, in clients who had been worried about something structural and complicated, and had just seen, concretely and clearly, that it was going to hold. She grabbed my hand and said, "Next week I will show my sister," which she did. I want to tell you about a morning about 5 months in that I've thought about more than almost any other moment in this past year and a half. I woke up early, before 6, the way I'd been doing since Ohio, and made coffee and carried it out onto the small balcony of my apartment, which looked out over a narrow street lined with older buildings and mango trees, and I sat there in the still, pre-traffic quiet, and I thought about Ellen. Not with the quality of mourning exactly, not the heaviness that had characterized most of those thoughts for so long, but with the quality of, I don't know how to put this precisely, company. As if she was just there, in the ordinary sense of there, the way she used to be in the mornings when I'd make coffee, and she'd still be asleep, and I'd sit by the window, and the house would be quiet, with the good kind of quiet, the kind that contains someone, rather than just their absence. I know that's not a thing I can explain rationally. I'm not going to try. What I can tell you is that I sat on that balcony for probably an hour, and when I finally came back inside and started thinking about what the day held, the Tuesday workshop and then lunch at Imelda's, and then a late afternoon walk with Rodrigo along the waterfront, I noticed that I had been looking forward to the day before I'd finished grieving in the morning, and for the first time I could remember in a long time, those two things were both just true at once, not in conflict, not one cancelling the other, just both true. That's the thing nobody explains about this particular kind of rebuilding. It isn't that you stop grieving. You don't. Ellen is woven through every single day, every coffee, every balcony morning, every meal eaten alone that I compare, silently, to a meal I would have told her about. What changes is that the grief starts having neighbors. Other things move in alongside it, and gradually the other things take up more of the available space, not replacing the grief, but proportionally reducing it through sheer accumulation of life, until one Tuesday morning you realize you've been looking forward to something, and that's not a betrayal of anyone. It's just the ordinary machinery of being alive, starting back up again after an extended shutdown. Claire flew over for a visit at the 7-month mark. I want to describe this visit in detail because it mattered enormously, and not in the way either of us quite anticipated. She arrived nervous. I could see it in the set of her shoulders at the airport, the particular way she has of carrying tension that I have known since she was 11 years old and have never once successfully pretended not to notice. She was looking, I think, for the performance of being fine, expecting to have to assess it critically, to search for the signs that this was a brave face rather than a real one. What she found instead was Rodrigo, who had come with me to the airport without my asking, and who introduced himself to Claire with the natural warmth of someone who has simply decided to take responsibility for the people he's decided to look out for, which apparently now included making sure my daughter arrived in this city feeling welcomed rather than just geographically located. She looked at him, then at me, and something in her face shifted almost immediately, not relaxed entirely, but shifted. Over the following 10 days I showed her the city the way I'd come to know it, which was not the way a tourist knows it, but the way a person who has been eating at the same 3 restaurants for 7 months knows it, with specific knowledge of which table at Imelda's had the best light, and which days the market near my apartment had the freshest fish, and which back streets cut 20 minutes off the walk to the waterfront. I introduced her to Gloria from the Tuesday workshop. These days, for the first time in longer than I'd like to admit, I wake up most mornings already thinking about the day ahead instead of just enduring it, already running through before my feet even hit the floor, whatever small thing needs doing, whoever's expecting to see me, whatever ordinary plan the day already has in motion, whether I have much of an opinion about it or not. I don't say that to suggest everything is perfect now, because it isn't, and I don't think any honest version of a story like this should pretend otherwise. There are still hard days. There's still an ache that never fully closes, and I've come to accept that it probably never will, and that this is all right, that it doesn't need fixing the way I once assumed it did. But underneath that ache, there's also now a real and steady pull toward tomorrow, something I'd lost for a long stretch of time and genuinely wasn't sure I'd get back. I did get it back, though, not all at once, and not because of any single dramatic decision, but because of a long accumulation of small, deliberate choices, each one modest on its own, that eventually added up to an entirely different life than the one I'd been quietly drowning in before.